Okay, we left off with us looking at the war, and this is the second to last lecture we'll have. And we're going to take a look at President Lincoln's assassination and then work our way into what the country looked like. President Lincoln is going to be assassinated 5 days after Lee will surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war's over. We're going to come back to maybe some semblance of normality. But 5 days after the South will surrender, the assassination will take President Lincoln out. And I just want to take you to what the mindset was. Lincoln was despised by the South. He was the arch enemy. He was the one that caused all this. And he was the focal point of the Southerners' hate that he would have this thing come about. A lot of people in the North also didn't like Mr. Lincoln because they saw him as uncompromising and brought the country to this unspeakable situation of carnage, both economically and in human loss, and just lives were completely upturned from what was going on. So Lincoln, at the end of the war, it looks like things are going to be getting better. Lincoln has been elected to a second term. He has been sworn in April or March of 1865. He's starting his second term. The war is ended on April 8th of 1865, and things look good. He is in Virginia at all of the powers came together after Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, accepted the surrender terms of Lee, and now Lincoln is going to do some relaxation. He goes to a play at a theater to watch a comedy with his wife and a young couple. At the same time, Lincoln goes to this. There is a group of conspirators, Southern conspirators, that are looking to overthrow the United States government. They were initially going to kidnap the President of the United States, but that ended. And so now you have the President with that they were going to kidnap the President and bring him back to the South. When the war ended, the conspirators realized they couldn't do that. So what they wanted to do was throw the government into an upheaval. And what they were going to try to do was they were going to try to assassinate the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State, William Seward. So those three were going to be shot, and then there was going to be this, upheaval, and there was going to be confusion, and the South could then continue to be going on their own. And that was the plan. Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865. Booth and his conspirators, as mentioned, wanted to overthrow the government into chaos. Lincoln, after being shot on the night of the play, will never regain consciousness, and he'll die the next morning. The other conspirators, Vice President Johnson, assassin, ended up going out, and he was the easiest guy, it looked like, to pick off. He had very little security detail, believe that. But the assassin, who is an alcoholic, and we're not going to get into all the names because I'm not going to put that on the test, but the gentleman that was assigned to kill President Johnson is an alcoholic. Instead of going and killing Johnson, he becomes scared, goes to a tavern and gets drunk, and then will chicken out and will flee, and he'll be found 3 days later, and he will confess to the entire plot. Secretary of State's assassin will have a little bit more success. There was two guys assigned to kill Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward will be in bed. He is bedridden. He is sick from something. I can't remember what that was. I should, but I don't. And he's bedridden. Two people are assigned to kill him. The one gentleman by the name of Powell and another one by the name of Harold. Powell is a 20-year-old soldier of the Confederate Army. He will proceed to try to get in to kill Seward and cause a great deal of carnage. He will wound 5 different people. He will wound 2 of Seward's sons, Seward's bodyguard. He will stab a bypasser just walking outside of Seward's house, a state employee, one of Secretary of State Seward's employees, and he will stab Seward several times in the chest and in the neck, but all of them will miraculously live. Powell will flee. His gentleman that was supposed to help him get away was a gentleman by the name of Harold. Harold will hear the commotion inside the house of this carnage, and he'll run and he'll flee. Powell will be found 3 days later and brought to justice, and he also will confess to everything that's going on. Booth, after shooting President Lincoln, will get into an altercation with the other young lieutenant military officer that was in the booth with Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln's wife. He will stab the soldier. Booth will jump off the second tier box, private box of the president, onto the stage, where he'll proceed to break his leg, but he still is able to hobble away, get on a horse, and flee to a designated spot where he will meet up with the other conspirator that was supposed to take care of Powell, and the two of them will then lead the Union on a 12-day manhunt of over 10,000 soldiers looking for Booth. And people knew who John Wilkes Booth was. He was a fairly well-known actor. His family had all been actors, and so they knew who he was. It became pretty quickly known that he was a Southern sympathizer, and eventually Booth, who will flee from Virginia to Maryland, will cross over back into Virginia, and he will be caught in a barn, tobacco barn in Virginia, and then he will be surrounded. The barn will be set on fire, where Booth will be shot by a Union soldier in the neck, and he'll die the next morning. And of that, they will then take the three other people, Harold, Powell, and a German person, these three guys along with a woman, and the four of them will be tried and hung for conspiracy against the United States and treason, and the four of them will be hung, and John Wilkes Booth will die at the scene. They're ending the saga of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Johnson will now become President of the United States. What does the nation look like after the war? Well, there's been a ton of political and economic changes to our country. The national government power will increase a ton after the war. The war proved one thing, that the national government wasn't this far away, distant little entity. It wasn't about your state and what your local government can do. The national government proved we can have a draft, we can take you out of your ranch or out of your job anywhere in the country, and you'll serve in the United States Army. And they actually brought back then we didn't have taxes, we didn't have income taxes. And during the war, the Union government will impose an income tax. Now, about 4 years after that, they will do away with it, but it will set the stage for later on, about 100 years, about 40 years later, we will have the income tax imposed. But it was imposed during the Civil War, and that meant that private people, not a part of the government, could have their income taken and taxed for the very first time. During the the Civil War, the National Bank Act set the national bank back in place. It was in place during Alexander Hamilton, but it had fallen out of favor. It will now be brought back, and banking laws will be set up where you'll have national banks setting the loan rate and overseeing all banks. And that was done during the Civil War. The economy in the North, believe it or not, during the war, it soared, which oftentimes does happen to an economy during the war, because people need items. They need guns, they need shoes, they need pants, they need bullets, and so people have to make those things. So your economy soars, and the economy in the North did soar because they needed all those things. So manufacturing absolutely went through the roof, and the economy in the North went through the roof. On the opposite side, the economy in the South was devastated. The North had a bigger and stronger Navy, and so it barricaded or blockaded the southern ports and did not allow ships to come in and out of those ports, so you couldn't transport goods to get money. The South couldn't. Remember, the South had no manufacturing before the war, and the little manufacturing they did was shut down. The South was caught because the North cut off a bunch of ways to grow food and to ship food. They seized the rails, and then the slave labor was stopped, and food was not grown. And with, as I mentioned earlier, Sherman's march across the South, the very tail end of it, he just cut and shredded railroad lines and burned his way through. A lot of Southerners will die of starvation. The Union forces lost a lot more people, though. The Union forces, underneath inept leadership during the first 2 years of the war, lost a sizable amount. I would say it's safe to say at least 100,000 more lives than the Confederates lost. They were better trained, even though the Confederates had far less material. Most of the people that were injured in war did not die because of the gunshot. They died because of lack of medical knowledge. They died of disease and cross-contamination because we didn't understand germ warfare and how germs will spread unless you sanitize the operating procedures. Disease and gangrene will set in. And so 1 out of 4 would die of the actual wound. The other 3 would die because of disease. The war was estimated at a cost of $3.3 billion. Now, what does that mean? Because we spent $1 trillion in the war against terror. For example, we spent over $1 trillion, probably $1.5 trillion in Iraq, and I would say probably something close to that, if not more, in Afghanistan since 9/11 and us going in 2003. So 3.3 billion is a drop in the bucket. But to give you a perspective, $3.3 billion was that was more than what we had spent the previous 80 years of our government being in power. So we had spent a ton. This will set the debt up a bunch and will impact the government and people's lives for the next 50 to 100 years. So there's a brief lecture over what had happened to the South and North economy and the assassination of President Lincoln.